For millennia, the galaxy had thrived under the watchful eyes of the ancient gods. These deities, powerful beyond comprehension, shaped the destinies of countless civilizations. Stars were ignited by their will, planets molded by their command, and entire species blessed or cursed by their favor. Empires rose and fell, their fates determined by the divine whims of beings who had existed long before the concept of time itself. And in all this, humanity was but a distant memory, a footnote in the annals of the gods' history. No one remembered when or why the gods had abandoned humans. Once a species that had been touched by their celestial hands, humans were cast aside, left to fend for themselves on the fringes of the galaxy. The gods moved on, their interests piqued by more promising creations, races with superior intellect, bodies forged for war, or minds wired for peace and diplomacy. The gods saw no further use for mankind, deeming them weak, primitive, and unworthy of their blessings. And so, humans fell into obscurity. Planets once ruled by human kings and queens were overtaken by other races, empires crumbled, and the ancient ruins of humanity's past glories were buried beneath layers of dust and time. Generations passed, and soon, not even the youngest stars remembered their existence. They became the forgotten ones, the forsaken race. But humanity, though forgotten by the gods, did not forget. While they no longer had the celestial favor that once gave them an edge in the cosmic arena, they had something far more potent: determination. And in the depths of forgotten worlds, in the ruins of cities long dead, they began to rise once more. The planet of HFY was one such place. It was a cold, desolate world on the outskirts of a galaxy where the light of the stars barely reached. Its harsh winds screamed across barren landscapes, and its frozen seas were a graveyard of forgotten ships from long-lost wars. But beneath the ice and snow, in the remnants of an ancient city, a small human settlement had endured for centuries. The people of HFY were survivors. They had learned to live without the comforts of technology that their ancestors once possessed. Their clothes were fashioned from the hides of ice beasts, their homes were carved into the mountainsides, and their weapons were crude but deadly. They fought for every scrap of food, every drop of water, and every moment of warmth. They had become hard, cold, and unyielding, much like the planet they called home. Among them was a young man named Yarrick. He was not unlike the others of his kind, tough, scarred, and burdened by the harshness of life. But there was something different about him, a spark that set him apart. His eyes, a deep blue like the frozen seas, held a fire that had not been seen among humans for generations. He dreamed of more than just survival. He dreamed of reclaiming what had been lost, of rising from the ashes of obscurity and reminding the galaxy of who they were. One night, as the winds howled and the ice cracked under the weight of eternal winter, Yarrick sat alone on a ridge overlooking the settlement. His breath formed clouds of frost in the air, and his skin burned from the cold, but he did not move. His mind was far away, lost in thoughts of the stars above. He had heard stories from elders, stories of a time when humans traveled the galaxy, when they were warriors, scholars, and explorers. But those were just stories, legends passed down from generation to generation, with no proof of their truth. "You're wasting your time, Yarrick," a voice called out from behind him. It was Mira, his closest friend, and the only one who understood his restless spirit. She was as tough as he was, maybe tougher, with short-cropped hair and a face marked by the struggles of their harsh existence. "The stars aren't going to give you any answers." Yarrick sighed, but didn't turn to face her. "What if they do?" he asked quietly. "What if there's something out there, Mira? Something that could change everything for us?" Mira sat down beside him, pulling her fur cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Even if there is, how will we find it? We're stuck here, on this frozen rock. The rest of the galaxy has forgotten us. No one cares about humans anymore, not even the gods." Yarrick clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the cold. "That's the problem. We were forgotten, but we don't have to stay that way." Mira frowned, looking at him skeptically. "And how do you plan on changing that?" with a stone axe and some ice beast bones. Face it, Yarok, we're not warriors anymore. We're survivors. Barely. He turned to her, his eyes blazing. That's exactly why we have to change things. We've survived longer than anyone expected. If we can do that, we can do anything. She shook her head, smiling slightly despite herself. You're impossible. I'm not the only one who thinks this way, Yarok continued. There are others. We can gather them. We can rebuild. Mira raised an eyebrow. Rebuild what? A society. A fleet of ships. We don't even have enough food to last the winter. Yarok stood, his breath coming out in rapid puffs of fog. We start small. We take back what's ours. Then we grow. The galaxy won't see us coming. But when they do, they'll remember why they feared us. Mira looked up at him, her skepticism giving way to a glimmer of hope. You're serious, aren't you? I am, Yarok replied. The gods might have forgotten us, but we haven't forgotten them. They abandoned us because they thought we were weak. It's time to show them how wrong they were. For a moment, the two sat in silence, the wind howling around them. Then, slowly, Mira nodded. All right, if you're serious about this, I'm with you. But where do we even begin? Jarek's eyes gleamed. We find the old city, the one buried under the ice. There's still secrets there, weapons, maybe even ships. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Mira hesitated, but then stood, pulling her cloak tighter. You're crazy, but I guess craziness is what we need right now. Together, they turned back toward the settlement, a plan forming between them. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but was also the beginning of something much larger, a rebellion against the gods themselves. The forgotten race was about to remind the galaxy of its existence. The stars above flickered faintly in the cold night sky, unaware of the storm that was about to rise from the frozen depths of Arctis V. Humanity was about to make itself known once more, and the gods will have no choice but to take notice. The next morning, the frozen winds of Arctis V howled louder than usual, as if the planet itself sensed the change coming. Yarok and Mira wasted no time. Their plan was dangerous, reckless even, but in a world where survival was all they had ever known, danger was a part of life. The only difference now was that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were preparing to fight back. Yarok stood outside the settlement's central meeting hall, a crude structure built from salvaged metal and stone. Around him, the other inhabitants of Arctis V went about their daily routines, their faces grim and tired. For most of them, the harsh reality of their lives had beaten down any sense of hope or ambition. They hunted, gathered, and tried to stay warm. Anything more was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Yarok wasn't looking for the average settler. He was looking for those like him, the ones who still had that fire in their eyes, the ones who weren't content to let humanity fade into obscurity. Mira approached him, her expression as unreadable as ever. They're gathering, she said quietly. Not many, but enough. Yarok nodded. It was a start. That's all we need. The two of them entered the meeting hall, the cold wind slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, the air was slightly warmer, though not by much. A handful of people stood in the center of the room, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a small fire pit. They were a rough-looking group, dressed in patched furs and worn leathers, their hands calloused from years of hard labor. But there was something in their eyes that Yarok recognized: determination. Yarok stepped forward, his voice steady and strong. You all know why we're here. The group exchanged glances, but said nothing. Yarok continued. For too long, we've been stuck on this frozen rock, barely scraping by while the rest of the galaxy forgets we even exist. The gods abandoned us, and we've been left to fend for ourselves. But we've done more than survive. We've grown stronger. One of the men, a large, bearded hunter named Gorn, crossed his arms. Stronger? We can barely keep ourselves alive. Yarok, what makes you think we're strong enough to take on the galaxy? Yarok met his gaze without flinching. Because we've survived where others will have died. We've lived without the gods' help, without technology, without anything. That's strength. And now, We're going to use that strength to take back what's ours." A murmur ran through the group. Some of them looked uncertain, others intrigued. Gorn snorted, unimpressed. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Mira stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "There's an old city buried under the ice. Our ancestors built it long before the gods abandoned us. If the stories are true, there are weapons there, ships, technology, things we can use to rebuild." Gorn raised an eyebrow. "If the stories are true, you're talking about risking our lives for a myth." Jarek's jaw tightened. "It's not a myth. My father found the entrance to the city before he died. He never made it inside, but it's there. I've seen the ruins myself." Another voice spoke up, this one belonging to Kira, a sharp-eyed woman who had been a scavenger for as long as anyone could remember. "Even if the city's there, how do we know the tech still works? It's been buried for centuries, maybe longer." "We don't know," Yarok admitted. "But what choice do we have? We stay here, and we'll freeze to death or starve within a generation. We go to the city, and maybe we find what we need to start fighting back." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Finally, Torvik, an older man with a scar running down the side of his face, spoke up. "We've all lost people to this planet. We've lost more than we can count. If there's even a chance that the city holds the key to our survival, then I say we take it." Gorn's scowl deepened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he uncrossed his arms and shrugged. "Fine, but if this turns out to be nothing but a wild goose chase, don't expect me to follow you again." Yarok nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Fair enough. We leave at first light. Gather your gear and be ready for anything." The group dispersed, each of them heading off to prepare for the journey ahead. Mira lingered behind, watching Yarok closely. "You sure about this?" "No," Yarok replied honestly, "but it's all we've got." She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Then let's hope we're right." The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn broke through the stormy skies, the small band of settlers set out across the frozen wastelands. The wind was bitter, cutting through their furs like icy knives, but none of them complained. They had all endured worse in their lives, and the thought of what might lie beneath the ice kept them moving forward. Yarok led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the entrance his father had discovered years ago. His mind raced with memories of his father's stories, tales of towering spires buried beneath the glaciers, of ancient machines that had once powered entire cities. It seemed impossible that such a place could still exist, but Yarok knew better than to doubt his father's words. For hours, they marched through the snow, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The landscape around them was bleak and unforgiving, endless fields of ice and rock, broken only by the occasional jagged peak rising from the frozen earth. The cold seeped into their bones, but they pressed on, determined to reach their destination before nightfall. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice, Yarok finally spotted it, a faint glimmer of metal peeking through the snow, half buried by the elements. His heart leapt in his chest, and he motioned for the others to follow him. "There," he called out, pointing to the metal structure. "We're close." The group hurried forward, their exhaustion forgotten in the excitement of discovery. As they reached the site, Yarok knelt down and brushed away the snow, revealing more of the ancient metal beneath. It was rusted and worn, but unmistakably artificial, a remnant of the lost city. "This is it," Yarok said, his voice filled with awe. "We found it." The others gathered around him, their faces lit with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Mira crouched beside him, running her fingers over the cold, rusted surface. "It's real," she whispered. "The city is real." Gorn grunted, unimpressed. "Great. Now what? How do we get inside?" Yarok stood, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of an entrance. "There's supposed to be a way in somewhere around here. We just have to find it." The group spread out, searching the ground for any clues. Minutes turned into hours as they scoured the area, but finally, Kira let out a shout. "Over here," she called, waving them over. I found something. They rushed to her side and found her standing over a large metal hatch, partially concealed by a layer of ice. Jarek's pulse quickened as he knelt down and cleared away the snow, revealing a set of ancient symbols etched into the metal. "This is it," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "The entrance to the city." Gorn frowned, eyeing the hatch warily. "And how do we open it?" Jarek stared at the symbols, trying to make sense of the ancient language. His father had spoken of the city's defenses, of locks and traps designed to keep intruders out. But Jarek wasn't afraid. He knew, deep down, that this city had been built by humans, for humans. And if they had built it, then they could unlock it. He reached out and placed his hand on the hatch, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ground beneath them began to rumble. The hatch shuddered, then lifted with a loud, grinding noise as the ancient mechanisms came to life. The group stepped back, watching in awe as the entrance to the lost city revealed itself. "Welcome home," Jarek whispered, a fierce smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The ancient metal hatch creaked and groaned as it opened, revealing a dark, gaping hole descending into the heart of the forgotten city. The air that escaped from below was cold and stale, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of ancient decay. Jarek's heart raced in his chest as he stared into the abyss, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. This was it, the beginning of something far larger than any of them had anticipated. Around him, the others stood in silence, their faces lit by the soft glow of the dying sun. Mira was the first to speak, her voice low and steady. "We should be careful. We don't know what's down there." Jarek nodded, though his excitement was hard to contain. "We will be, but we need to move fast. The storm's coming, and we don't want to be caught out here when it hits." They had all seen the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, an icy tempest that would turn the wastelands of Arctis V into an even more inhospitable hellscape. If they didn't find shelter inside the city, they wouldn't survive the night. Gorn, always the skeptic, stepped forward and peered into the darkness below. "You sure this is a good idea, Jarek? We don't know what's waiting for us down there. Could be traps, or worse." "We've come this far," Jarek replied, gripping the rope that hung by the entrance. "We didn't survive this long by playing it safe." With that, he began his descent, the others following closely behind. The climb down was treacherous, the metal ladders slick with frost, but they made their way slowly and carefully into the depths of the ancient city. The further they descended, the colder the air became, and the dim light from above faded into pitch-black darkness. When they reached the bottom, the group found themselves standing in a massive underground chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with towering pillars of stone and metal, covered in ancient symbols and carvings. The floor beneath their feet was smooth, though cracked in places, and littered with debris from the passage of time. Mira knelt down, brushing her fingers over the cracked surface. "This place is old, really old. Older than we thought," Kira muttered, her eyes scanning the room. "No one's been here in centuries." Torvik, the elder of the group, approached one of the pillars and ran his hand along the carvings. "These symbols, they're human. This place was built by our ancestors." Jarek nodded, his breath visible in the frigid air. "This is it. This is what we've been searching for." But Gorn wasn't convinced. He paced the chamber, his eyes darting warily to every shadow. "And now what? We're inside, but we still don't know what the hell we're looking for. We need food, supplies, weapons, not a bunch of old rocks." Jarek turned to face him, his voice firm. "This place was built by people like us, people who had the same needs, the same desires. They wouldn't have built a city like this if they didn't have something to protect. There's something here, Gorn. We just have to find it." The group spread out, their footsteps echoing through the vast, empty chamber. The only light came from the dim glow of their torches, flickering in the icy air as they searched for any sign of the treasures their ancestors had left behind. Jarek's heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the walls for any clue. any indication of where to go next. As he passed by one of the larger pillars, he noticed something strange, an indentation in the stone, almost like a handprint. His pulse quickened as he reached out, pressing his hand against the cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low rumble, the wall before him began to move, sliding aside to reveal a hidden passageway leading deeper into the city. Jarek's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, calling out to the others. "I've found something." The group hurried over, their faces filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. Mira was the first to reach him, her eyes wide as she peered into the newly revealed corridor. "It goes further down," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the moving stone. "How deep does this place go?" "Only one way to find out," Jarek replied, stepping into the passageway. The others followed without hesitation, their torches lighting the way as they descended once more into the depths of the forgotten city. The passage was narrow and cold, the walls closing in around them as they moved further away from the surface. The air was thick with the weight of centuries, and every step echoed through the darkness like a ghostly whisper. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom, emerging into a smaller chamber lined with metal doors. Each door was marked with the same strange symbols they had seen above, but these were different, more intricate, more deliberate, as if they held some deeper meaning. Kira stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the markings. "These symbols, I've seen them before. They're not just decorative, they're instructions." Torvik nodded, his voice grave. "They're warnings. Whatever's behind these doors was meant to be kept sealed." "Sealed," Gorn snorted. "More like locked away, which means there's something valuable inside." Jarek's hand hovered over the nearest door, his mind racing. The temptation to open it, to see what lay beyond, was almost overwhelming. But something about the symbols gave him pause. His father had always warned him about the dangers of the ancient world, about the secrets that had been buried for a reason. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low. "This place was built to protect something, but we don't know what." Mira stepped beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Jarek nodded, knowing she was right. There was no turning back. Not now. He placed his hand on the door and, with a deep breath, pushed it open. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a room unlike anything they had seen before. The walls were lined with strange, glowing machines, their lights flickering faintly in the dark. In the center of the room stood a massive metal pedestal, and resting atop, it was a single glowing orb. The air in the room felt different, charged, almost electric, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around the object. Jarek stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the pedestal. "What is it?" Mira whispered, her eyes wide with awe. Jarek didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, his thoughts jumbled. This was what they had come for. This was the key to everything. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the orb. In an instant, the room was bathed in blinding light. Jarek felt a surge of energy course through his body, like lightning running through his veins. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt as though he was being pulled into the orb itself, into something far greater than himself. And then, just as suddenly, the light faded, and the room returned to its cold, dark silence. Jarek stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind was reeling, his body shaking from the sheer force of what he had just experienced. But despite the overwhelming sensation, one thing was clear. The orb wasn't just an artifact. It was a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. "We need to take this," Jarek said, his voice hoarse. "This is the key. This is what we've been looking for." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt a deep, unsettling presence in the back of his mind, a warning, a reminder of the power he had just unleashed. The gods may have forgotten humanity, but they hadn't forgotten the weapons they had left behind. And now, those weapons were waking up. "Are you sure about this?" Mira asked, her voice filled with concern. Jarek nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I'm sure this is how we take back what's ours." With the orb in hand, the group began their ascent, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them like a storm cloud. They had come seeking answers, seeking power, and they had found it. But as they climbed back toward the surface, one thought lingered in Jarek's mind. What had they just awoken? The climb back to the surface was longer than Yarek remembered. Each step seemed to echo louder, each breath heavier, as though the walls of the ancient city were closing in on them. The orb, now safely tucked away in Jarek's pack, pulsed with a faint glow that illuminated the narrow passage around them. It felt as though the thing had its own presence, alive, watchful, as if it were waiting for something or someone. No one spoke as they climbed. The weight of what they had found, of the power they now carried, was too much for words. Even Gorn, who had been the first to scoff at the idea of the lost city, remained silent. There was no room for skepticism anymore. They had found something ancient and powerful, and perhaps more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Mira was the first to break the silence as they neared the surface. "What do we do now?" Yarek didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the orb pulling at him, not physically but mentally, as though it was urging him, whispering things just outside the edge of his understanding. It was disorienting, yet strangely invigorating. He felt stronger, more alive, as though the energy of the artifact was feeding into him. "We take it back to the settlement," Yarek finally said, though his voice sounded distant, even to himself. "We study it, learn what it can do. This is the key to everything. We have to understand how to use it." Torvik, the elder, grunted. "And if we can't, what if this thing is too dangerous? I've lived long enough to know that some powers are better left buried." Yarek glanced at him, the old man's weathered face lit by the glow of their torches. "If we don't use it, someone else will. The galaxy has forgotten us, but it won't forget this. We have to be the ones to control it, not them." Gorn's voice cut through the tension. "And who exactly are they, Yarek?" "The gods. The ones who threw us away like scraps." Yarek stopped, turning to face him. Maybe the gods left this behind for a reason. Maybe they knew we'd find it eventually. Mira frowned, her face tight with worry. Or maybe they left it behind because it was too dangerous. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. We'll figure out," Yarek said, his tone final. "We have no choice." The group fell silent again as they reached the top of the ladder and emerged back onto the frozen surface of Arctis V. The storm they had seen approaching earlier was now in full force, the icy winds howling across the landscape and whipping snow into blinding flurries. They pulled their fur cloaks tighter around themselves, their bodies bracing against the cold as they trudged back toward the settlement. But even as they fought against storm, Yarek could feel something stirring deep inside him, something tied to the orb. It was as though the artifact was connected to the world around them, to the storm, to the very air they breathed. Every gust of wind, every flake of snow felt alive, aware, as if the planet itself was reacting to the presence of the orb. By the time they reached the settlement, the storm had grown into a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled like a wild beast, slamming against the buildings with enough force to rattle the walls. The settlement's main gates creaked open as the group stumbled inside, the cold biting at their exposed skin as they made their way to the central hall. Inside, the fire in the hearth was barely enough to warm the room, but it was better than the raging storm outside. The settlers gathered around, their faces drawn and tense as they looked to Yarek for answers. "What did you find?" one of the older settlers, a woman named Sarah, asked, her eyes flicking nervously to the pack on Jarek's back. Yarek didn't hesitate. He pulled the orb from his pack and held it up for all to see. The room fell deathly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the artifact as it pulsed with a soft, blue light. The glow filled the hall, casting strange shadows on the walls and illuminating the faces of those gathered around. "This," Yarek said, his voice steady, "is what we found." There was a collective intake of breath as the settlers stared at the orb, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Even those who had doubted the existence of the lost city couldn't deny what was right in front of them. Torvik stepped forward, his expression grave. "That thing, it feels wrong, Yarok. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing like this. What do you plan to do with it?" Yarok looked down at the orb, his fingers tightening around it. He could feel its power surging through him, its energy wrapping around his mind like a vice. But he didn't let go. He couldn't. "We learned from it," he said. "This is what we need to take back our place in the galaxy. This is our key to survival. With this, we can rebuild. We can make them remember us. But at what cost?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "There are stories, old stories, about artifacts like that. They're powerful, yes, but they corrupt. They twist people. You're talking about playing with forces we can't even understand." Yarok met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "I understand the risks, but we don't have a choice. If we don't use this, someone else will. The gods left us behind. Sarah, they abandoned us. Now it's our turn to take control." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Jarek's words hanging heavy in the air. Mira stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "I'm with you, Yarok. We've been forgotten long enough. It's time to remind them who we are." One by one, the others nodded their agreement, though some did so reluctantly. Even Gorn, who had been the loudest voice of skepticism, gave a begrudging nod. The decision was made. Yarok turned to Torvik. "You're the oldest here. You know more about the old stories than anyone. Help us understand what we're dealing with." Torvik hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the orb. "I'll help you, but I'll tell you this. I've lived through wars, plagues, and disasters, but nothing scares me more than what you're holding right now. If we're going to use it, we need to be damn sure we know what we're getting into." Yarok nodded. "Agreed. We'll study it, learn everything we can before we act." The group dispersed, each of them retreating to their homes to prepare for the long night ahead. The storm outside had intensified, the winds battering the settlement with relentless fury. But inside the central hall, Yarok and Torvik remained, staring at the glowing orb in silence. "Do you think the gods know we found it?" Yarok asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the artifact. Torvik's expression darkened. "If they didn't before, they do now." Yarok felt a chill run down his spine, but it wasn't from the cold. The thought of the gods, those ancient beings who had once ruled the galaxy, turning their gaze back toward humanity, was both exhilarating and terrifying. For so long, they had been nothing more than myths, distant and unreachable. But now they were waking up. As the night wore on, Yarok couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried a whisper just beyond his hearing. The orb pulsed faintly in the darkness, its glow casting eerie patterns across the walls. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the storm, it happened. A sound, a low, distant rumble that seemed to come from the very heart of the planet itself. Yarok froze, his breath catching in his throat as the ground beneath his feet trembled. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Torvik nodded, his face pale. "It's them, the gods. They know." Before Yarok could respond, the orb in his hand flared to life, its glow intensifying until the entire hall was bathed in blinding light. He felt a surge of energy rush through him, more powerful than anything he had felt before. His body tensed, his mind overwhelmed by the sheer force of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light faded, leaving the room in complete silence. Yarok staggered back, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He glanced at Torvik, who looked just as shaken. What just happened?" Yarok asked, his voice hoarse. Torvik didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the orb, his eyes wide with fear. "It's a beacon," Torvik whispered, his voice trembling. "You've just called them back." Jarek's blood ran cold as the weight of Torvik's words sank in. The gods were coming. Yarok stood frozen in place, his hand still clutching the orb as the last remnants of its blinding light faded into the cold morning air. The rumble beneath their feet had stopped, but the unease it left behind was palpable. The central hall was silent, save for the faint sound of wind howling outside. Torvik's words echoed in Jarek's mind, repeating over and over like a curse. You've just called them back. The gods, the beings who had created and then abandoned humanity like forgotten toys. For centuries, the galaxy had gone on without them, leaving humans to scrape together what remained of their legacy. Now, with a single action, Jarek had awakened something far more powerful than he could have imagined. He looked down at the orb in his hand, its glow now dim and harmless, as though it were nothing more than a common stone. But Jarek knew better. The artifact was a beacon, a signal sent out into the vastness of the universe, calling the gods back to the place they had forsaken so long ago. We need to leave, Torvik said, his voice low and urgent. Now, before they get here, Jarek snapped out of his daze, his mind racing. Where would we go? There's nowhere to hide from them. Torvik, if they're coming, they'll find us, no matter where we run. Torvik shook his head, his face grim. There are old places, hidden places. If we can get far enough, maybe... His words were cut off by a deafening crack of thunder. The sound came not from the sky, but from deep within the earth. The entire settlement shook violently, sending Jarek stumbling into a wall. Outside, the howling wind grew louder, more ferocious, as though the storm itself had been awakened by the same force that now gripped the planet. Mira burst into the hall, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Something's happening. The ground is splitting open outside, like the planet's tearing itself apart. Before Jarek could respond, the sky outside darkened, not from clouds, but from something else. Something massive, a shadow larger than anything he had ever seen, descended from the heavens, blocking out the dim light of the rising sun. It was the first of the gods. The being that hovered above the settlement was unlike anything Jarek had ever imagined. Its form was vast, shifting, a swirling mass of light and shadow that defied comprehension. Where its face should have been was an endless void, a black hole that seemed to consume the very fabric of reality. And yet, despite its otherworldly appearance, there was something unmistakably familiar about it, an ancient presence that had lingered in the deepest corners of human memory for eons. The settlers who had gathered outside stared up in awe and terror, their voices caught in their throats. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. They had long believed the gods were myths, legends told to children to explain the world's mysteries. Now, faced with the undeniable truth of their existence, the weight of their forgotten power, there was nothing they could do but watch. Jarek felt a pull from the orb, like an invisible hand dragging him toward the entity in the sky. He clutched it tighter, fighting the urge to give in. The orb vibrated in his hand, its glow intensifying once again, and with it came a flood of thoughts, memories not his own, voices from the past, from ancient humans who had once stood where he did now. He saw flashes of cities long forgotten, empires that had stretched across the stars, and the gods who had once ruled over them. And then, the voices were silenced. The visions faded, leaving only one voice behind. It wasn't his father's or Torvik's or anyone from his settlement. It was the voice of the god. You called, and we have answered. The words echoed in his mind, as clear as if they had been spoken aloud. Jarek felt his body go cold, his heart pounding in his chest. The god's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, but he fought to keep control. Why? He thought, his mind reaching out to the entity. Why did you leave us? For a moment, there was no response, only the sound of the storm raging outside. And then, slowly, the god's voice returned, colder and more distant than before. You were unworthy. You were weak. We gave you everything, and you squandered it. Jarek clenched his fists, anger surging through him. We didn't ask for your gifts, he said aloud, his voice trembling with rage. You abandoned us, left us to die while you moved on to your next creation. You forgot about us, and now you come back to judge us. The air around him grew heavy, and the god's voice deepened, resonating with the force of 1,000 stars collapsing into one. You were meant to serve. You failed. And now, you will be erased. Jarek's heart skipped a beat. Erased? The word hung in the air, like a death sentence. He looked around at the faces of his people, his friends, his family. The gods didn't see them as people. They saw them as failures, mistakes to be wiped clean from existence. But Jarek wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't ready to let his people, his race, be erased like a bad memory. Not after everything they had survived, everything they had endured. The orb pulsed in his hand, the energy inside it growing stronger, more focused. It was the key, the weapon. Jarek didn't fully understand its power, but he knew one thing for certain. It was humanity's last hope. He turned to Torvik, his voice urgent. There has to be a way to fight back. Something the gods didn't expect. Torvik hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. You can't fight the gods, Jarek. They're too powerful. We're nothing compared to them. We've survived without them for centuries, Jarek said, his voice fierce. We've survived everything this galaxy has thrown at us. If they want to fight, then we'll give them one. Mira stepped forward, her hand on Jarek's shoulder. You're right. We can't just stand here and let them wipe us out. We have to fight. Jarek nodded, his resolve hardening. He could feel the power of the orb coursing through him, stronger than before. It was as if the artifact itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to strike back against its creators. The gods abandoned us, Jarek thought, his grip tightening on the orb. Now it's time for them to remember. With a deep breath, he raised the orb toward the sky, toward the god that hovered above them. The air crackled with energy as the artifact flared to life, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The god shifted in the sky, its form becoming more defined, more solid, as though it were preparing to strike. But Jarek didn't back down. He focused all of his will, all of his strength, into the orb, pouring everything he had into the glowing artifact. And then, with a deafening crack, the energy of the orb was released. A beam of pure, blinding light shot from the artifact, striking the god directly. The sky exploded with sound and color as the force of the blast ripped through the air, sending shockwaves across the frozen landscape. Jarek felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as the god's form flickered, distorted, and then shattered. For a moment, there was silence. The storm outside had stopped, the wind stilled, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone. Jarek stared up at the sky, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The god was gone, destroyed. The settlers around him stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Torvik was the first to speak, his voice a whisper. You killed it. Jarek lowered the orb, his hand trembling. We killed it. Mira stepped beside him, her eyes filled with awe. We did it. We fought back. And we won. But even as the words left her lips, Jarek felt a chill run down his spine. He had defeated one god, but there were others, many others. And they wouldn't be as easy to defeat. We won this battle, Jarek said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. But the war is just beginning. He turned to face the others, his voice filled with a newfound determination. We have to prepare. They'll come for us now, all of them. But we have something they didn't expect. We have the power to fight back. The settlers nodded, their fear giving way to hope. They had been forgotten, abandoned by the gods who had once ruled over them. But now they had a chance to reclaim their place in the galaxy, to rise from the ashes of their past and forge a new future. The gods would return, but this time, humanity was ready, and the galaxy would never forget them again.